As most of you know, we focus on a particular topic each month. And this month, for September, we are going to focus on spiritual growth. Now, what do you think of when you hear the term spiritual growth? Do you think of some monk or hermit sitting on the top of a mountain in deep meditation? Generally speaking, spiritual growth is not well understood in American culture, and so tools for spiritual growth, such as meditation, are also not well understood either. This lack of attention ignores the reality that spiritual growth and meditation are important and long-standing traditions in Christianity. More recently, science has also identified meditation as a powerful tool for personal growth and emotional health. Yet meditation is a tool that is drastically underutilized in American culture. Why do you think that is? Any ideas? Well, for one thing, while meditation is specifically mentioned in the Bible, as we heard in the Psalms, it's not mentioned very often. Right? There are no stories that directly say that Jesus engaged in meditation, although Jesus did seem to go to the top of mountains to pray a lot. And for most of us growing up, there were no classes in school or in church about spiritual growth or about meditation. And so if we wanted to learn about that, we needed to look into it ourselves. So let's start with spiritual growth, and after we establish kind of an understanding of spiritual growth, I'll talk a bit more about what meditation is in that context. In the Christian tradition, spiritual growth can be defined as the process of becoming more like Jesus, or more Christ-like. And not just to act like Jesus, but to have a deep trust and a love for God and neighbor, as demonstrated by Jesus, and to live that trust and love out in the context of our modern lives. Being more Christ-like impacts all areas of our lives, and so spiritual growth can be defined and understood in many different ways. Jesus demonstrated a way of life that's possible when we are spiritually mature or fully experience God's presence. So spiritual maturity is a level of awareness, a level of understanding of reality and of God. Our limited awareness means that we see the world using a small candle of understanding based on our limited awareness and our limited experiences. Spiritual growth is about increasing our light and our perception of life in particularly healthy ways. Opening up our perception occurs by moving our lens and our light from a narrow self-interest to a much wider and deeper level of understanding. So spiritual growth is the process of increasing our loving awareness both of ourselves and of the world around us. Spiritual growth is how we learn to be more loving and more faithful people. An increase in spiritual awareness sometimes takes a direct healing, sometimes a touch of God, an epiphany, like a beam of light or a lifting of a cloud so we can better see the world. And not just see the world physically, but to see and understand how things relate to one another and how things are connected, how they're dependent on one another, and the possibilities of that, of how such an understanding enables what you can do and act as with a motive of love when you see how things are actually connected. As we grow spiritually, our lamp gets brighter and lights up more dark corners of our own lives, helping us to cast light for other people in helpful ways as well. Ideally, our spiritual lamp does not get brighter in a way that draws attention to ourselves, but instead in a way that draws attention to God and that draws attention to love. Instead of shining our little candle on ourselves, which is our natural tendency, we engage in a brighter light focused on God. Spiritual growth, expanding our light like that, increases our awareness. And it naturally allows us to be more like Jesus in our day-to-day lives and in our relationships with others. We all have a certain brightness of light, a certain level of spiritual growth or maturity, and that level changes ideally as we age, as we experience life, although I'm not going to say there are probably a few of us adults that are toddlers in the spiritual growth area. And there's a reason for that. But no matter where we're at, there's ups and downs in our spiritual maturity as we make mistakes and as we learn. In some ways, spiritual growth is no different from physical growth or mental growth. And in other ways, it's unique and more difficult to understand. We all grow physically, mentally, and spiritually starting shortly after we're born. We as a culture are very focused on the things required for an individual's physical growth and mental growth. But we're really not focused on what's required for emotional or spiritual growth. For physical growth, we provide good nutrients, fluids, exercise, play. For mental growth, we teach a language, provide an education. What do we do for spiritual growth tends to be less intentional. And yet most of us grow along these lines as well as we develop through our childhood experiences and then into adulthood. The direction of our growth depends on many things, including our motives, our attitudes, and the level of spiritual maturity of those around us. For example, our physical growth can be damaged significantly if we choose to avoid physical activity. If we do nothing but sit and watch TV and stare at a computer, what happens? Have you seen it happen before? It's surprising how quickly we lose our spiritual abilities when we stop. How quickly we use our physical abilities, our spiritual abilities too, but how quickly we use our physical abilities if we stop using them. Physical therapists tell us, especially as we get older, use it or lose it. The same thing goes for our mental growth, our brain health. If we don't use our minds, if we don't exercise our brain, our mental growth will be impacted. And we usually are much more intentional about our physical and mental health than we are about our spiritual health. And this can make us unbalanced. Bringing ourselves in balance requires extra effort in the area that we're lacking in. And for most of us, let's be frank, it's spiritual maturity. And it's not our fault. It's the world we've grown up in. So what should we do to get better balanced? We know that when it comes to any kind of growth, intention is important. Because intention indicates that at some level we've made a decision and decided on a direction. We've decided we're going to improve. Or in some cases, we've decided that we're not, in the case of mental decline, that we're not going to decline anymore. We're going to do what we can to hold our ground. And that we're willing to put effort into it. Even more important, that we're aware enough of our own state of being. We're self-aware enough to want to be more loving, to want to be more present for other people, to want to be more peaceful and non-anxious. Do you want to be a non-anxious presence in the lives of the people around you? Spiritual growth is how that comes to be. And not everyone desires spiritual growth, and for a variety of reasons. When you think about it, becoming more like Jesus is a lot to ask. Jesus gave himself fully, and not everyone's ready for that. He gave up all his material belongings to wander and to teach. Not everyone wants to or is ready to commit to becoming selfless, loving, healing, and to be as connected to God as Jesus exemplified. Yet, each of us can still take steps in that direction if we try. even if they're only small steps, to being a more loving person, to living a more fulfilled life, to experiencing real emotion in deeper and more impactful ways. Wherever we are in our spiritual journey, we can put one foot in front of the other and move forward on the path if that's our intention. And if we can get the guidance we need. And God doesn't force us. It's up to us. We must be engaged ourselves to use our own will to desire a more loving existence. And it's important, it's useful to understand that our own intentions, in fact, we have to it kind of starts with understanding our own intentions. Because it's usually our intentions that change the most as we engage productively in spiritual growth activity, including meditation. All right, did you catch that? As we grow spiritually, it's our intentions that changes the most if we're truly growing. Today's scripture from Matthew about prayer indicates the importance of intention in our spiritual efforts. If we pray, if we meditate just to be seen by others, if we engage in spiritual growth with the intention to gain earthly advantage for ourselves, we will impede rather than advance our own spiritual growth. Our intentions must become selfless in order to follow the path of Jesus Christ, eventually. But all too often, if we do want spiritual growth, our motive, our reason for spiritual growth is going to be selfish. It might be that we're trying to gain power or influence or to gain acceptance by other people in the community, or maybe to show that we're better than others. But in any case, if it's all about me, hey, look, I'm being a wonderful person, that's going to impede our growth. It's part of what today's scripture is trying to tell us. Another step in the human spiritual journey, like the next step up in terms of spiritual growth, sometimes involves fear of God. Do you experience fear of God? This might happen at a point for a number of reasons, when perhaps one of us sees that we've hurt others in our lives and we begin to sense a degree of justice in the universe and we fear punishment. A desire to engage in spiritual growth out of a fear of punishment, out of a fear of going to hell, is a typical step along the way. If we're at that point in our life, fear can be a powerful tool to get us to change our behaviors, to make better decisions, to stop acting like it's all about me. Fearing God or fearing punishment can get us to start noticing that other people are important too. Yet fear can only take us so far on the journey, because fear is an indication that at some level we don't trust God. As we learn to trust God more and more, as God reaches out in grace and touches our hearts, our fear is replaced by love and by trust. Spiritual growth requires the ability to look introspectively at our fears, at our intentions, at our hearts. What's in both our heads and our hearts. And understand the forces behind those fears and intentions. When we understand the forces behind them, we can start making adjustments. To make adjustments that are in line with Christ's example. Make adjustments that allow us to be more forgiving and more giving and less judgmental. And oh my God, don't assume that it comes easy. In fact, once you have the intention of spiritual growth, once you arrive at that intention, the first thing is it seems impossible. But it's not. Our entire tradition is evidence that it's not. It's the kind of ability that we can gain as we grow spiritually, as God's lamp of spiritual growth begins to burn more brightly through us. Our own motives, our own intentions become more apparent to us. Right? We become more self-aware as part of this process. For example, consider whether if we tend to read the Bible out of fear of punishment, or whether we read the Bible because we want to live a more loving and Christ-like life. What's going to happen? See the difference? How intention? If your intention of reading the Bible is fear of death, versus if your intention of reading the Bible is to become an example of love. Do you think different things are going to stick out to you? Think you're going to learn different lessons? The Bible will speak to us in different ways depending on our own intentions. This is absolutely vital to understand if we're going to move forward spiritually. Our motive, our reasons for reading the Bible have a lot to do with how we understand and how we interpret what we read. Either motive, fear or love, can be valuable depending on where a person is in their spiritual growth. But eventually, fear as a motivating force should become transformed through our spiritual growth into trust and love. Another practical challenge when pursuing spiritual growth is, well, it's boring. My God, it's boring. Let me tell you how boring it can be. I mean, what would you rather do, right? Sit and contemplate your own motives and meditate on the eternal presence of God, or watch a good movie? In many ways, spiritual growth is boring because of our misplaced priorities and intentions. Being bored can be defined as the feeling that we get when we are not making progress on our true desires and wants. That's when something. So right away, if meditation seems boring to you, if spiritual growth seems boring, it's pointing a finger at your desires and wants if you're paying attention. You can learn from that. If spiritual growth is not what we want at a deep level, it's going to seem boring. But don't let that stop you. We all have to start someplace. Spiritual growth is the process of changing our wants and our desires from things that are destructive and counter to God's plan to things that are constructive and consistent with Christ's teachings. Meditation is a time-tested tool to deal and work on this area of our lives as it impacts everything else. To our own detriment, it's often ignored. I'm talking 10, 15 minutes a day, every day. I've said it many times before. After about 3-4 weeks, your life is going to change for the better. Try it, but you got to do it every day. None of us are perfect. 5 days out of the week, how about that? As often as you can. For some of us, when we get up in the morning and when we go to bed at night, twice a day. That's not. Eventually, the effort grows in our lives and becomes all-encompassing. But it starts with just 5 or 10 minutes of just stopping and saying, what am I doing in life? What's my purpose? And, maybe another word for meditation is contemplation. Maybe we should use that word more often, contemplation. Contemplate our own desires. Are they helping me or are they hurting me? Are they making me more of an expression of love or are they making me more of an expression of selfishness? Meditation, contemplation starts out as questions. Why am I alive? What's my deepest desire? And why do I desire that? Is it good for me to desire it? Do I really want to be? Does that really make sense? Eventually, that path should lead us to the big question. What is God's will in my life right now? If what I want is not my own selfish, what is God's want? As our intentions begin to align with the example of Jesus, as our desires get caught up in God's desires, as our ship begins to be blown by the winds of love, contemplation becomes surrender. And you literally just sit. Meditation can be just sitting and surrendering yourself to God. Not surrender in a negative sense. I don't mean surrender the way we use the word about in human battles and wars. This is a different sort of surrender, more of surrendering our fears, surrendering our anxieties, letting go of them, sharing them with God as an act of trust. Surrendering to God, to God's plan, is an experience of love that energizes and transforms life. Do you experience life as love on a moment-to-moment basis? You're designed to do that. You're intended to do that. Most of us are those somewhere in between, somewhere on the spiritual path between being totally self-centered and being able to be and experience God's eternal presence in each moment. But no matter where we are on our spiritual growth path, meditation and contemplation can help. So can prayer. So can music. Music that lifts us, that draws us closer to God. Communion. All the things we do here in church are intended to support our spiritual growth. And some of you have noticed and mentioned to me that a church that focuses on spiritual growth feels very different from a church that focuses on fear and punishment. Our focus at this church is much more about spiritual growth rather than fear, because love, not fear, is central to the inclusive church tradition, and it's central to the example of Jesus Christ. And it is the nature of God. 1 John 4, God is love. 1 John 4 also says, perfect love casts out all fear. Too often, we as Christians have made coming to church more about fear, punishment, and reward, or about heaven and hell, than about becoming more Christ-like. Spiritual growth and contemplation can be difficult concepts for us to get our heads around, especially with how busy our lives are, how action-packed our modern lives tend to be. What if we just took the afternoon off to go sit under a tree for a little while in the shade? If everyone understood the deep emotional satisfaction, the unconditional love, the experience of life as love, the removal of anxiety that spiritual growth offers, this church would be full every Sunday. Even in the face of everything new and modern, this ancient practice continues to stand as something helpful and good for us, something tried and true over the generations. And so we seek God's light to guide our way. So our spiritual lamps will grow brighter, lighting up all the corners of our lives and helping us to cast light for other people in loving ways as well, as demonstrated by Jesus Christ.